911, what's your emergency? The calm, almost mechanical voice of the operator echoed through the speaker, a familiar sound in the chaotic symphony of a major city. But on the other end of the line, that composure was shattered by a man's gasping, broken voice, thick with an unconcealable horror. I need the police. Right now. At Reverend Washington's house. 245 Peachtree Avenue. Oh God, there's blood everywhere. I think there's been a murder. The dead silence that followed was more terrifying than a scream, a void filled with the image of an unspeakable tragedy. It was an early Wednesday morning in the middle of July in Atlanta, Georgia. The sky still held a hint of dawn's gray, promising another sweltering summer day. In Buckhead, one of the city's wealthiest and most prestigious neighborhoods, tranquility still reigned. Perfectly manicured lawns were still damp with dew, and stately mansions stood silent like sleeping giants. This was where the American dream was proudly displayed, a world of success, power, and a flawless facade. But inside the two-story red brick house at the end of the road, a nightmare had just torn through that velvet curtain of perfection. The man who made that fateful call was Deacon Octavius Freeman, a respected elder of the Holy Atonement Church, and a close friend of the Washington family for over a decade. He had arrived, as he often did on Wednesday mornings, to discuss church matters with his pastor before the day began. But when his calls and texts went unanswered, a vague sense of unease prompted him to stop by. The front door was unlocked, a startling anomaly in the always secure home. As he pushed it open, the metallic coppery smell of blood hit him, a scent so alien and grotesque in the pristine, luxurious space. And then he saw it, a scene that would be forever seared into his memory. The wail of the first police sirens grew from a distant cry to a piercing shriek, tearing apart the morning quiet. Curious neighbors began to peek through their curtains, their faces etched with surprise and concern. Police cars and ambulances were a rare sight here, and their presence was a grim omen. Among the first to arrive on the scene was Detective Malik Brooks of the Atlanta Police Department. At 42, Malik was a solidly built black man with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen too much of the city's dark side. He was not easily shocked, but when he heard the address read over the radio, a strange feeling stirred within him. Reverend Leroy Washington. He'd heard the name. Who in Atlanta hadn't? Leroy was an icon, a beacon of hope and strength for the African American community, a man whose voice could move even the most hardened souls. As Malik crossed the threshold, a chill washed over him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The scene inside was a ghastly contrast, sanctity-stained. The home's usually fresh air was now thick with the smell of death. Forensics technicians in their white hazmat suits had already begun their meticulous work, their movements silent and respectful, as if in a funeral rite. The kitchen, where the tragedy had unfolded, looked like a painting by a deranged surrealist. Gleaming granite countertops, high-end cherry wood cabinets, and modern stainless steel appliances all reflected the flashing red and blue lights from outside. And in the midst of that luxury, lying on the white tile floor, was the body of Reverend Leroy Washington. He lay in a pool of blood that had begun to dry and darken. The crisp white shirt he always wore, a symbol of his purity, was now stained a deep crimson from a single, clean, and fatal stab wound to the center of his chest. His face was a mask of surprise and pain, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if asking God one final question. But it wasn't the body that made Malik stop, that made the air in his lungs feel like ice. It was the woman sitting motionless beside him. Emily Washington, the pastor's 43-year-old wife and perfect partner, sat on the floor, her back against the kitchen cabinets. Her eyes were vacant, lifeless, staring through everything and at nothing. She was a statue carved from grief and shock. Her elegant cream-colored silk nightgown was spattered with a few drops of blood, small as fallen petals. Her hands that had shaken thousands of parishioners, rested limply in her lap. She wasn't crying, she wasn't speaking. She just sat there, a silent, terrifying presence next to her dead husband. A young patrol officer was trying to speak to her in a soft voice, but his words seemed to dissolve in the air before they could reach her. Malik knew instantly, with the cold certainty of a seasoned professional, that this was no random home invasion. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing disturbed besides the life that had been taken. This tragedy, this rage, had been born from within these very walls. It had been nurtured in silence, behind false smiles and public prayers. The question wasn't who did this. In a detective's mind, the prime suspect is always the one closest. The real question, the one that sent a shiver down Malik's spine, was why? What could drive Imani Washington, an icon of grace, virtue, and piety, a woman who had dedicated her life to uplifting her husband, to such a horrific and final act of violence? As he looked into her empty eyes, Malik knew the answer would not be simple, and it would unravel a story far darker and more complex than the pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Just 3 days earlier, on a brilliant Sunday morning, the atmosphere inside the Holy Atonement Church was entirely different. It was vibrant, warm, and filled with hope. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, painting luminous patterns across the polished oak pews. The church was packed. Men in their finest suits, women in elaborate hats and elegant dresses. They came from all over Atlanta, from wealthy enclaves to working-class neighborhoods, all seeking the same thing: salvation, guidance, and a dose of inspiration from the man on the pulpit. When the clock struck 10, a side door opened, and Reverend Leroy Washington entered. The entire congregation fell silent, his presence alone commanding respect. Leroy was more than just a pastor. He was a phenomenon. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of a former football player, he exuded a unique kind of power and charisma. His navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, the gold cross around his neck gleaming in the light. But it was his eyes that truly captivated people. Intelligent, sharp, and capable of seeing right through you. He was the epitome of African-American success and power, a man who had shattered invisible ceilings with sheer talent and boundless ambition. "Good morning, brothers and sisters." His deep, velvety voice resonated throughout the church, needing no microphone. "Today, we're going to talk about faithfulness. Faithfulness to the Lord, faithfulness to our promises, and faithfulness to one another." Ironically, that very sermon, delivered with all his passion and eloquence, was a prelude to a horrifying truth no one could have imagined. Leroy was a master of words. He could make the most hardened skeptics reflect, the most sinful weep. He had built Holy Atonement from a small, struggling church into a megachurch, a spiritual empire and a political force in the city. Politicians came here to shake hands and be seen. Businessmen came to network. And ordinary people came to hear a message that they too could overcome any adversity, just like their pastor. And there in the front row, as always, was Mrs. Imani Washington. She sat there, her posture perfect, with an elegant and almost serene face. Her cream-colored dress contrasted beautifully with her dark skin, and her hair was styled in a flawless, neat bun. She listened to her husband's every word, nodding in approval from time to time. To the congregation, they were the image of the mask of perfection. They were the golden couple, a model of Christian marriage, a living testament to the values Leroy preached. He was the spiritual leader, and she was his devoted partner, the woman behind the great man. But Deacon Octavius Freeman, sitting a few rows back, saw the small cracks in that facade. He was a middle-aged, portly man, with a wisdom that came from years of observing human nature. He saw the way Imani smiled at an elderly parishioner who was praising her husband's sermon, but her eyes held a distant sadness, a weariness that no smile could hide. "Sister Imani, you must be so proud of the Reverend," old Mrs. Johnson said. "Such a heartfelt sermon on faithfulness. I haven't heard one like it in years." Imani just smiled lightly. "Yes, my husband has a way with words, Mrs. Johnson." The comment, though polite, had a cool, detached quality. Octavius had known the Washingtons long enough to sense the almost imperceptible tension when they stood side by side, greeting the congregation after the service. There was an invisible distance between them, a silence heavier than words. Octavius had once seen Leroy lash out with unreasonable fury at a white church staffer over a minor scheduling error at an event. The anger was disproportionate to the mistake. It felt like the eruption of a long suppressed pressure, the pressure to always be perfect, to always be an example, especially as a black man in such a high-profile position, under the constant scrutiny of both the black and white communities. He wondered if that pressure was eroding their marriage from the inside. Was maintaining this mask of perfection draining the life out of both of them? After the last parishioner had left, Imani approached her husband, who was discussing something with Octavius. "I'm going home to start dinner," she said. "You remember Zora is coming today, right?" Leroy frowned for a moment, as if he had genuinely forgotten, but then quickly smiled. "Of course, darling. I'll be home in an hour or so." Octavius noticed a shadow pass over Imani's face before she turned away. It was disappointment, familiar and quiet. He knew this family, and he could see what lurked behind the facade of a perfect marriage: tension, unspoken grievances, and perhaps pain. He had no idea that a new catalyst was about to be added to this already volatile mix, a catalyst that would push everything to the point of no return and turn those small cracks into an unbridgeable chasm. The Washingtons' home was situated in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, a 15-minute drive from the church. It was a 2-story red brick residence with a meticulously manicured garden and a spacious veranda, a house that perfectly reflected its owner's status. As Imani slowly climbed the steps, she felt the exhaustion of a morning spent playing a part weigh heavily on her shoulders. She turned the key in the lock, and the heavy door swung open, welcoming her into the cool, silent interior. Here, away from the prying eyes of the congregation, she allowed herself to relax. The perfect mask fell away, revealing a face etched with weariness and a quiet sadness. She went straight to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Her movements were practiced, mechanical, honed by years of repetition. Slicing vegetables, marinating meat, turning on the stove. But her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Zora, her little sister, whom she hadn't seen in almost a year. Zora, who was in college in California, was a world away. Zora was a whirlwind of energy and rebellion. If Imani was the stillness of a calm lake, Zora was the crashing waves of the Pacific. At 21, Zora had already changed her college major 3 times, modeled for indie fashion labels, and even had a small part in an art house film. Zora lived a life unbound by convention, a life Imani secretly envied but would never admit, even to herself. The sound of a taxi pulling up front interrupted her thoughts. Too soon for Leroy, and then a clear ringing voice echoed through the house before the door even opened. "Imani, are you home?" "Zora." "In the kitchen," Imani called back, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. A moment later, Zora appeared in the kitchen doorway, a vibrant picture of youth and freedom. She was slender, dressed in ripped jeans and a loose blouse. But the most striking thing was her hair. It was cut short and dyed a defiant burgundy, a direct challenge to the conservative world Imani inhabited. The sisters embraced, and Imani breathed in a strange perfume, both sweet and spicy, the scent of adventures she would never have. "You look amazing, big sis," Zora said, pulling back and looking Imani up and down. "This house is still just as spotless, and so are you. Nothing ever changes, does it?" Imani detected the gentle irony in her sister's words, but chose to ignore it. "You look beautiful too, Zora. It's just this hair. What will Leroy say?" Zora laughed, shaking her brightly colored locks. "Oh, I'm sure Leroy will find some quote from the Bible about the diversity of God's creations or something. He's always been a master at finding the right words." As they set the table together, Zora chattered about college life, new friends, and vague future plans. Imani mostly listened, feeling an inevitable distance between their two worlds. When everything was ready, the front door opened again. "I'm home!" Leroy's voice boomed through the house. A moment later, he appeared at the kitchen doorway. His gaze first fell on Imani perfunctorily, then immediately shifted to Zora. And in that fleeting moment, something flashed in his eyes. It was more than just surprise. It was admiration, an almost raw appraisal, and a spark of desire that Imani hadn't seen him direct at her in years. It was the seed of destruction, a tiny moment pregnant with devastating potential. Imani felt her heart clench. "Zora, what a surprise!" Leroy smiled broadly, opening his arms. Zora, looking a little bewildered, stepped forward to hug her brother-in-law. "What kind of surprise, Leroy? Imani said you knew I was coming today." Of course," Leroy quickly corrected himself, but his eyes never left Zora. "I meant, I'm surprised by how much you've changed. That hair, it's certainly expressive." He kept smiling, a smile that Imani felt lasted a little too long. She tried to push the thought away, telling herself she was being oversensitive. "Let's have lunch before the food gets cold," she said, her her voice strained. Lunch was a painful performance for Imani. Leroy, who was often tired and distant with her after services, was suddenly alive and charming. He told funny stories about the parish, asked Zora about her classes, and was completely focused on her. Imani noticed the way he leaned forward whenever Zora spoke, the way he laughed a little too loudly at her jokes. She felt like an invisible spectator at her own table, a caterer rather than a participant in the conversation. "How long are you planning to stay with us, Zora?" Leroy asked as the meal was ending. "A couple of weeks if you two don't mind," Zora replied. Imani felt a cold dread at the thought. "Your room is always ready," she said, beginning to clear the plates, trying to sound like a hospitable host. Leroy stood up, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "Great. I have some work to do for next Sunday's sermon. I'll see you two at dinner." He left the room, and Imani noticed Zora's gaze follow him, an expression of curiosity and admiration. Something in that look made her deeply uneasy. She dismissed it again, blaming it on fatigue, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and in the seemingly perfect soil of this house, it had found a fertile place to begin to grow. The following days passed in a tense, simmering atmosphere, a false calm that masked the powerful undercurrents shifting beneath the surface. Zora quickly settled into the rhythm of the house, though she spent most of her time exploring the city with old friends or reading in the sun-drenched garden. Leroy remained busy with church affairs, while Imani continued her familiar routine of household chores and charity work. But there was a subtle change that Imani could no longer ignore. Her husband started spending more time at home. He suddenly had paperwork to do in his home office instead of at the church. He would frequently appear wherever Zora was, striking up conversations with her. He offered to show her his collection of rare theological books, or take her to see historical sites in Atlanta she'd never visited. Each of these actions, taken individually, seemed innocent enough. But strung together, they formed a disturbing pattern. One evening, about a week after Zora's arrival, Imani was walking from the laundry room upstairs when she passed by the living room. She was about to continue on her way, but a scene inside made her freeze in the doorway. Leroy was sitting on the plush leather sofa with Zora. They were looking at a large art book together, and their heads were bent so close they were almost touching. Leroy's arm was resting on the back of the sofa, just behind Zora, so close it was almost brushing her shoulder. An easy, comfortable intimacy, a closeness that she and Leroy hadn't shared in a very long time. Imani stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, and felt a sharp, bitter sting of jealousy. It was acrid and unexpected, an emotion she hadn't felt in years. But immediately after, a wave of shame washed over her. "This is Leroy," she repeated her familiar mantra to herself. "My husband, a pastor, a man of God. And Zora is my sister. I shouldn't be having these thoughts." She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, and stepped into the room with a forced smile. "What are you two looking at so intently?" Both Leroy and Zora started, and Leroy quickly pulled his arm back. The flicker of guilt on their faces betrayed more than their actions had. But that thought, once it had taken root, refused to leave. It haunted Imani as she lay beside her husband in their cold bed, feeling his distance more acutely than ever. It gnawed at her as she prepared breakfast and heard Zora and Leroy's animated laughter from the garden. She began to notice every small detail. The way Leroy praised Zora's new dress, the way his gaze lingered on her a moment too long when she wasn't looking, the phone calls he would take in his study with the door closed. Each one was a small pinprick to her bleeding heart. And then, the shadow of doubt grew even darker the following Sunday. Imani sat in her usual seat in the front row, a statue of piety, but her mind couldn't focus on Leroy's sermon. After the service, as she was accepting the usual pleasantries from the parishioners, a stranger approached her. She had vaguely noticed him sitting in the middle pews during the service. He was dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit, unlike the flashy attire of the businessmen and politicians who often attended. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice calm but confident. "My name is Malik Brooks. I'm a detective." Imani felt a jolt of alarm. A detective? At church? "I just moved to the neighborhood and was looking for a church," he continued, smiling politely. "I'd heard great things about your husband's sermons. I must say they weren't exaggerated." Imani smiled back, trying to hide her unease. "A pleasure to meet you, Detective Brooks. I hope you'll become a regular parishioner." But there was something about the way this detective was looking at her. It wasn't the gaze of a newcomer seeking spiritual connection. It was a sharp, observant assessment, as if he were seeing right through her, reading the thoughts she was trying so hard to hide. The encounter was strange, almost premonitory. As she was pondering it, Deacon Octavius approached, his usually calm face now etched with worry. "Sister Imani," he said in a low voice, glancing around, "may I have a private word with you?" Her heart clenched. She had a feeling that the defensive wall she had been trying to build around herself was about to be breached. She followed Octavius into a small meeting room, and when he closed the door behind them, she knew her life was about to change forever. She had no idea that the conversation to come would not only confirm her worst fears, but would also push her down a path of no return, a path that would end in tragedy and blood. The small meeting room at the church felt unusually suffocating. The fluorescent light overhead cast a harsh glare, highlighting the worried lines on Deacon Octavius Freeman's face. He remained silent for a long moment, his hands clasped on the table, seemingly struggling to find the right words. Imani stood there, waiting patiently, but inside, her heart was a chaotic drumbeat. She felt as if she were standing before a judge, about to hear a verdict. "Sister Imani," Octavius finally began, his voice low and heavy with reluctance, "I don't know how to start this conversation, and God knows I don't want to cause any discord in your family, but my conscience won't let me stay silent." He took a deep breath. I've noticed some changes in Reverend Leroy's behavior lately. He's become distracted in meetings, sometimes answering inappropriately. And I've seen..." He hesitated, unable to look her in the eye. "I've seen the way he looks at your sister, Zora. That's not the way a pastor, a brother-in-law, should look at a young woman." His words struck Imani like a physical blow. They confirmed everything she had tried to deny, all the fears she had tried to bury. It wasn't her imagination. It was real. But then Octavius added a detail that was even more damning, a detail that turned suspicion into cold, hard certainty. "That's not all," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The other night, I came back to the church to get my glasses, which I'd left behind. It was late, around 10 o'clock. I saw a light on in the Reverend's office, so I went to see if everything was all right. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw them in there, the Reverend and Zora." Imani felt her breath catch in her throat. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard the Reverend's voice. He said something like, 'I can't stop thinking about you.' As soon as I heard that, I left immediately. I didn't want to get involved." Every word from Octavius was another stab wound to Imani's heart. The betrayal was no longer a vague specter. It now had a shape, a voice, a specific time and place. Her husband's office, his sacred space. "Thank you, Deacon Octavius," she said, and she was surprised by the calmness of her own voice. It was cold and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "I will handle this." Octavius looked at her with concern. "Sister Imani, please be careful. Maybe I misunderstood." But Imani was no longer listening. She left the room, her heart heavy as lead. She had said she would handle it, but she didn't. Instead, she chose the ignored warning. To confront the truth meant confronting the collapse of everything. It meant destroying the perfect image, the status she had paid for with years of loneliness. It meant admitting that her marriage was a sham, that the man she had placed all her faith in had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. So, Imani did what she had been doing for years. She buried it. She convinced herself that Octavius, an older, conservative man, had misunderstood. Maybe Leroy was just offering counsel to a troubled young woman. Maybe "I can't stop thinking about you" was part of a conversation about faith or temptation. She clung to these fragile explanations like a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. But denial could not last forever. On Tuesday, 2 days before the tragedy, the truth found her in a way she could not ignore. After breakfast, Leroy announced he had an urgent meeting at the church and wouldn't be home for lunch. Shortly after Zora left the house to go to the mall, an irresistible impulse led Imani to get in her car and drive towards the church. She just wanted confirmation, to see his car in the parking lot, so she could tell herself that everything was fine, and his black Lexus was there, parked in its usual spot. A fleeting sense of relief washed over Imani. She was about to drive away, but then she saw Deacon Octavius emerging from a side door of the church. She rolled down her window and waved to him. "Hello, Sister Imani," Octavius said as he approached. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was just passing by," she lied. "Is Leroy very busy?" Octavius's face changed. A look of confusion crossed his features. "Reverend Leroy? I thought he was working from home today. He's not at the church." Imani's heart stopped. Her whole body went cold. "But his car is right there," she stammered, pointing at the car. Octavius turned to look. "That's strange. I've been at the church all morning and haven't seen him at all." "Maybe he's in his office," Imani suggested, though she knew what the answer would be. "I just came from there." Octavius shook his head. "There's no one there." Silence hung between them, heavy and full of implication. Leroy had lied. He was using the church as a cover. But if he wasn't at the church, where was he? And with whom? The answer suddenly hit Imani with a painful, blinding clarity. Zora had said she was going to the mall. Was that also a lie? In that moment, Imani knew she could no longer live in denial. She had to know the truth, no matter how brutal. She decided she would not go home. She would wait, and she would follow him. She had to see it with her own eyes, so there would be no more room for doubt or excuses. Imani didn't drive home. Instead, she found a spot on a small side street nearby, a discreet place from which she could watch the entire parking lot of the Holy Atonement Church. She turned off the engine, leaned back in her seat, and waited. Time seemed to crawl by with agonizing slowness. Every car that entered or left the lot made her heart leap. She felt like a character in a cheap thriller, a betrayed wife spying on her husband. But the feeling of humiliation was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. She had to know the truth. About an hour later, her wait paid off. The door to the church office opened, and Reverend Leroy Washington stepped out. He moved quickly with a somewhat furtive air, glancing around before getting into his Lexus. He pulled out of the parking lot, and Imani waited a few seconds before starting her engine and following, keeping a safe distance so as not to be seen. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety and fear. She didn't know what she was expecting, or rather, what she was dreading. Leroy didn't drive towards Lenox Square or Phipps Plaza, the upscale malls where Zora had said she was going. Instead, he turned onto a road leading towards Midtown, in the direction of Piedmont Park. Why the park in the middle of a workday? The question twisted in Imani's mind, sowing more poisonous seeds of doubt. The park was a place for secret meetings, for whispered promises under the shade of trees, a perfect place to hide an illicit affair. Leroy parked in a lot on the north side of the park, a less crowded area. He got out of the car, adjusted his collar, and walked deep into the park with hurried steps. Imani found a parking spot further away and followed him on foot, staying hidden behind the ancient oak and magnolia trees. The park was relatively deserted at this time of day, with only a few joggers and a couple of couples lounging on the grass. Imani felt lost and alien in her own city, as if she were trespassing into a secret world where she didn't belong. She saw Leroy walk along a winding path, occasionally stopping and looking around as if he were waiting for someone. Finally, he reached a small clearing, a secluded spot surrounded by dense trees, with just a few wooden park benches. And there, on one of the benches, sat none other than Zora. Imani felt the air get sucked out of her lungs. She quickly hid behind the trunk of a large oak tree, its rough bark digging into her cheek. She watched the scene unfold before her like a silent horror movie. All the sounds of the park, the birds singing, the wind rustling through the leaves, the distant laughter, faded away. All that was left was the scene in front of her. Leroy approached Zora. Zora stood up when she saw him, a radiant smile on her face. And then they embraced. It wasn't the chaste hug of a brother-in-law and sister-in-law. It was a tight, intimate, hungry embrace, the hug of lovers who had been apart for too long. Imani's whole body trembled, but the biggest shock was yet to come. After the long hug, Leroy pulled back slightly. He brought his hands up, gently cupping Zora's face, his fingers stroking her burgundy hair. He looked deep into her eyes for a moment, and then he bent down and kissed her. The Judas kiss. It was a long, passionate kiss, with no attempt to hide the desire. A kiss that obliterated every doubt, every excuse, every fragile hope Imani had left. In that moment, Imani's world collapsed. Everything she had built, everything she had believed in, all her sacrifices over the past 20 years, it all shattered into a million pieces. This betrayal was so cruel, so blatant. It didn't just come from the husband she had spent her life serving and supporting. It also came from her own sister, the one she had loved and protected, the one she had held in her arms just a few days ago. They were doing this right in front of her, in broad daylight, without a hint of shame. Imani didn't remember how she got back to her car. She didn't remember how she drove home. Her mind was a chaotic mess of rage, pain, and a numbness that was almost a relief. The puzzle pieces now fit together perfectly. The lingering glances, the accidental touches, the whispered conversations, Zora's shopping trips, Leroy's urgent meetings. It was all part of an elaborate play of deceit, and she was the only audience member who had been kept in the dark. When she arrived at the empty house, its silence seemed to mock her. Imani didn't cry, she didn't smash things. The rage inside her was too big, too deep to be expressed. It was cold and still like an iceberg. She went into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of cold water, but her hands were shaking so much that she spilled it. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair she always sat in, and she waited. She would confront them. She would listen to their lies, their excuses. And then, she didn't know what would happen then. But she knew one thing for sure. The woman sitting there waiting was no longer Imani Washington, the perfect pastor's wife. That woman had died in the park, under the shade of an oak tree, along with the treacherous kiss of her husband and sister. The sun began to set, painting the Atlanta sky in hues of orange and purple, but Imani didn't notice. She sat motionless in the growing darkness of the kitchen, a ghost in her own home. Every sound from outside, a passing car, a barking dog, made her flinch. She waited. Time seemed to stand still, stretching into an endless torture. Finally, she heard the familiar sound of Leroy's car turning into the driveway. A moment later, the front door opened, and she heard their voices and laughter. They were laughing. The joy in their voices was like a knife twisting in her wound. They walked into the house, hand in hand, completely unaware of the storm that was waiting for them. When Leroy flipped on the kitchen light, the smiles on his and Zora's faces instantly froze. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw Imani sitting there, her face in shadow, only her eyes glinting dangerously in the light. She looked like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. "Imani," Leroy stammered, his usual confidence gone. He discreetly tried to let go of Zora's hand. You're home early? I thought you had a meeting at the charity committee." Imani lifted her head, and her gaze, a mixture of cold pain and simmering rage, swept over both of them. "The meeting was canceled," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. It was as cold as ice. "I saw you two. At Piedmont Park. I saw everything." The naked truth was out. There was no more room for lies. Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating. Zora's face went pale as a sheet. She took a step back, as if wanting to hide behind Leroy. "Imani, let me explain," Leroy began. "It's not what you think." "So what am I supposed to think, Leroy?" Imani stood up, her hands clenched on the table. Her voice began to tremble, not from weakness, but from a rage that had been suppressed for too long. "That my husband, Reverend Leroy Washington, the man who preaches about faithfulness and truth every Sunday morning, is kissing my sister in the park like some teenager." The weak cliché excuses began to pour out. "It just happened," Zora mumbled, her eyes fixed on the floor. "We didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" Imani laughed, a bitter, mirthless sound. "Or you didn't want to get caught? You came to my house, ate at my table, slept under my roof, all while you were sleeping with my husband behind my back." "No one planned anything," Leroy interjected, trying to control the situation. "We couldn't fight these feelings." "Feelings?" Imani turned to him, contempt flashing in her eyes. "What deep feelings can develop in a few weeks, Leroy? Or has this been going on for longer?" She saw the way they exchanged a panicked glance, and she knew she had hit the mark. "How long?" she asked, her voice as sharp as a razor. It was Zora who answered, her voice barely a whisper. "A few months. Since last Christmas. We started texting, then calling. Christmas," Imani remembered. Zora had been home for a visit, and Leroy had been unusually attentive to his troubled little sister-in-law. It had all been an act. "And you let me invite her here," Imani turned back to Leroy. "Knowing you were having an affair. You let her sleep in my house while you were sleeping with her. How could you be so cruel?" And then something in Leroy shifted. The feigned remorse vanished, replaced by irritation and defensiveness. He was cornered, and his instinct was to attack. "Don't pretend to be some innocent saint, Imani," he roared, his voice suddenly loud and menacing. "You know damn well our marriage has been dead for years. We live like roommates, nothing more. You were perfectly happy with that, as long as you got to play the part of the perfect pastor's wife, respected by everyone." Those venomous words hurt more than the physical betrayal. They attacked the very core of her identity, her choices, her sacrifices. "I loved you," Imani said, her voice cracking. "Even when you grew cold and distant, I still believed we could get through it. You love the status," Leroy sneered. "You love this house, the security, the respect you got from the congregation. You loved the idea of a successful black husband who could protect you from the outside world, a world you've always been afraid of. But you never really loved the real me, with all my flaws and desires." Imani looked at the man in front of her, and for the first time, she saw him for who he truly was. Not the respected pastor, not the husband she once loved, but a selfish, cruel hypocrite hiding behind a cloak of holiness. All the love, all the respect she had left for him evaporated, leaving only disgust. "Get out," she whispered, her voice drained of all energy. "Get out of my house. Now." Zora, tears streaming down her face, was the first to turn away. But Leroy stood his ground, as if wanting the last word. "I'm filing for divorce, Imani. Zora and I are in love. We want to be together." Those words, though expected, still struck Imani with the force of a physical blow. "Go!" she repeated, no longer looking at him. Finally, Leroy turned and followed Zora out the door. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed like a gunshot, marking the end of a life and perhaps the beginning of something far worse. After the sound of their car faded into the distance, the house plunged into a heavy silence, a silence that was more deafening than the screaming match that had preceded it. Imani stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling a numbness so profound it was almost a physical sensation. She didn't cry. The tears seemed to have run dry, or perhaps the pain was too immense to be released by tears. She felt like a shipwreck, sinking slowly to the cold, dark bottom of the ocean. 20 years of her life, 20 years of sacrifice and devotion, all washed away in a single afternoon. She went upstairs, walking into their bedroom, a room that now felt alien and cold. She began to pack Leroy's things mechanically. Shirts, ties, expensive suits. Each item was a reminder of his deceit. She threw them into suitcases without any care, not bothering to fold them. She didn't want anything of his left in this house. About an hour later, as she was carrying the last suitcase down the stairs, she heard the front door open again. Her heart clenched. Leroy was back. She put the suitcase down and stood waiting at the foot of the stairs, bracing herself for another confrontation. Leroy walked in, and this time, there was no trace of remorse on his face. It was a mask of impatience and irritation. "I forgot my phone," he said curtly, his eyes glancing at the suitcases packed neatly by the door. He walked straight into the kitchen to find it. Imani followed him, an overwhelming weariness washing over her. She no longer had the strength to be angry. She just wanted it all to be over. As Leroy found his phone on the dining table and was about to leave, Imani asked one final question, a question that escaped from the deepest, most broken part of her soul. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Did you ever love me, Leroy?" Leroy stopped at the doorway, turning back. He looked at her, not with sympathy, but with a cold pity. "Of course I did," he shrugged, as if discussing something trivial. "When we first got married, I was sincere, but then life became a routine. You became an obligation. I felt trapped, Imani. Trapped in a marriage that no longer brought me joy, trapped in the role I had to play." And then, as if to extinguish the last flicker of her spirit, he delivered the final, fatal blow. The breaking point. "You weren't the first, Imani," he said, his tone casual, almost cruel. "Zora wasn't the first. There have been others. That confession, delivered so nonchalantly and without a shred of remorse, broke something deep inside Imani. It wasn't just the betrayal of a husband, it was the collapse of her entire worldview. This man, who stood on the pulpit every week preaching about morality and faithfulness, was a serial adulterer. Her entire life, her entire faith, had been built on a lie. "How many?" she asked, her voice a broken whisper. "3 or 4 over the years," he said, a hint of annoyance in his voice at being questioned. "I'm only human, I have needs, but with Zora, it's different. With her, I feel alive again." "You've ruined everything," Imani said, feeling a cold rage begin to rise from the abyss of her despair. "Not just our marriage, but my relationship with my sister, my faith in the church, in God, in everything." Leroy sighed with exasperation, as if he were dealing with a petulant child. "Don't be so dramatic, Imani. You're a strong woman. You'll get through it. I have to go." He turned his back on her, completely dismissing the pain he had just inflicted. And it was in that moment, as he turned his back on her, as his contempt was made brutally clear, that Imani's vacant gaze saw it. The large kitchen knife, its stainless steel blade gleaming, was still on the wooden cutting board where she had been preparing the dinner no one ate. It sat there, an ordinary kitchen utensil, but in that moment it seemed to be calling to her. She didn't remember moving. She didn't remember her hand closing around the cold handle. She didn't remember stepping towards Leroy, who still had his back to her, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. She only remembered his surprised and somewhat annoyed face as he turned around at the sound of her footsteps. She only remembered the sudden shock and disbelief in his eyes as the cold steel blade, propelled by 20 years of suppressed pain, plunged deep into his chest. Leroy recoiled, his hands flying to the wound. A choked gasp escaped his throat. Blood began to pour out, a dark stain on his pristine white shirt. He looked at Imani, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief, and then he slowly crumpled to the floor. Imani stood there, looking down at the man dying at her feet. The knife slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the tile floor. Silence descended. The rage was gone. The pain was gone. All that was left was an infinite, terrifying emptiness. She had killed her husband, and in the dreadful silence of the kitchen, she felt no remorse. She only felt release. Back in the harsh reality of the windowless interrogation room at the Atlanta Police Department, Detective Malik Brooks looked at the woman sitting across from him. Imani Washington, now dressed in a standard-issue jumpsuit, looked small and fragile, but there was a resolve in her eyes, a defensive wall that seemed impenetrable. "I went to bed early," she repeated for the 3rd time, her voice a flat, emotionless monotone, as if she were reciting a script. "I took a sleeping pill because I was so tired after Sunday. The next morning, I came down to the kitchen to make coffee, and I found him like that. I was in shock. I don't know what happened." Malik knew she was lying. Every instinct of a seasoned detective screamed that she was lying. But why? Why construct such a flimsy, transparent web of lies? Malik was a good, methodical detective. He saw the inconsistencies immediately. The medical examiner's preliminary report placed the time of death between 9 and 10 p.m., the previous night. How could Imani have gone to bed early and not heard a thing during a violent attack in her own home? The house had a security system, and there were no signs of a forced entry. And the biggest question, why didn't she call 911? Why was it Deacon Octavius who discovered the scene hours later? Her story was too weak, too thin, almost an insult to his intelligence. Malik decided it was time to apply pressure. He placed the case file down on the table with a decisive thud. "Mrs. Washington, we spoke to Deacon Octavius. He told us he had a private conversation with you on Sunday. He said he warned you about your husband's relationship with your sister, Zora Parker." Imani was silent, her gaze dropping slightly to her hands, which were clasped on the table. A small crack had appeared in her defensive wall. Malik pressed on, his voice still calm but firmer. "We're also looking for your sister, Zora. Do you know where she is? She wasn't at the house when we arrived. Was she there last night?" "I don't know." Imani shook her head, but a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her. Malik knew that the key to breaking through this wall of silence was Zora. The young woman was the missing link, the witness who could either confirm or refute Imani's story. He signaled to an officer outside, telling him to have units canvass all hotels and motels in and around Atlanta, using Zora's name and description. In the digital age, it wasn't too difficult to find someone, as long as they used a credit card or ID. While he waited, Malik felt that this case was more complex than it appeared on the surface. He had handled countless domestic violence cases before. Usually after the act, the perpetrator would be in a state of panic or deep remorse, or would be aggressively self-defensive. But Imani was different. She was strangely calm, almost detached. That calmness unsettled him. It wasn't like the shock of an innocent person who had witnessed a horrific scene. It was more like the cold acceptance of someone who had made a decision and was ready to face the consequences. Or perhaps it was a deeper form of denial, a psychological mechanism to protect herself from the horrific truth of what she had done. Malik also couldn't shake a small but significant detail from the crime scene. The house, especially the kitchen, was too clean. Except for the large pool of blood where Leroy's body lay and a few small stains on Imani's clothes, there were almost no other traces of a violent attack. The murder weapon was lying neatly beside the body. Everything seemed too tidy. It was almost as if someone had tried to clean up, albeit hastily and imperfectly. He had a gut feeling that the crime scene was hiding something else his team had missed, a small detail that could change the entire case. He knew he had to go back to that house. In the meantime, he needed to find Zora. That young woman held the truth. And Malik was convinced that once Zora started talking, the web of lies Imani was trying to weave would collapse like a house of cards. He just hoped they could find her before any more tragedy struck. The search for Zora Parker didn't take long. A few hours later, a call from a cheap motel on the southern outskirts of Atlanta confirmed her location. The desk clerk remembered a young woman with burgundy hair who had checked in late the previous night, looking very upset and accompanied by an older man who had later left. When Malik and his partner knocked on the door of room 207, Zora opened it after a few moments. She looked completely devastated. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying, her rebellious hair now a tangled mess. When Malik introduced himself and broke the news of Leroy's death, Zora nearly collapsed. She had to grab onto the doorframe to steady herself, her face turning a ghastly shade of white with shock and horror. After she had calmed down a little, Zora's story came pouring out like a broken dam, a stark contrast to Imani's testimony. She told them everything, holding nothing back. The months-long affair, the blind passion, being discovered by Imani in the park, and the fiery confrontation that followed. "She threw us both out of the house," Zora sobbed, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "Leroy brought me here. He said he was going back to the house to get some things and talk to Imani one last time. Then he would come back for me. But he never came. I called him all night, but he didn't answer." With Zora's testimony, Malik now had the complete picture of the events leading up to the murder. He had a clear motive, the jealousy and rage of a betrayed wife, but he still needed more solid physical evidence to secure a conviction in court. The uneasy feeling about the crime scene still lingered in his mind. He decided to return to the Washingtons' house, this time with a more critical eye. "Something's not right," he told his forensics team as they re-entered the kitchen. "The scene is too clean. A stabbing like this, there should have been more blood spatter, some sign of a struggle, however minor." He looked at Imani, who was sitting silently in the living room under the watch of a female officer. She seemed calm, but was it possible she had tried to erase evidence in a state of post-homicidal panic? "Get the K9 unit," he ordered. It was a decision based on intuition, but Malik had learned to trust his gut. A short time later, Officer Miller arrived with Shadow, a large, intelligent German shepherd, one of the best K9s on the force, trained to detect drugs, explosives, and even hidden evidence like cleaned-up bloodstains. Malik led Shadow into the kitchen. The dog sniffed around the floor, around the appliances, but gave no particular reaction. Then, Malik led him out to the backyard, a peaceful green space where roses were in full bloom. He let Shadow explore freely. The dog ran along the fence, sniffing at the base of the trees. Suddenly, it stopped at a rosebush near the corner of the garden. It began to bark excitedly and pawed aggressively at the soft soil. "He's got something," Officer Miller said. The officers immediately grabbed shovels and began to dig carefully at the spot Shadow had indicated. Just a few inches beneath the damp earth, they found it. A white cloth kitchen towel, wadded up into a ball. When a forensics technician carefully unfolded it with tweezers, they saw that it was still slightly damp and covered in dark brown, almost black stains. The undeniable proof. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that confirmed Malik's suspicions. Imani, in her shattered state of mind after the crime, must have had a moment of primal, instinctual clarity. She had used the towel to wipe the blood from her hands and possibly the knife before throwing it on the floor. Then, in a desperate and imperfect attempt to cover her tracks, she had taken it out to the garden and buried it. That act, however clumsy, showed that she was not completely out of her mind or in such a state of shock that she was unaware of her actions, as she had claimed. It showed a consciousness of wrongdoing and an attempt, however feeble, to conceal it. With Zora's testimony, the murder weapon bearing only Imani's fingerprints, and now the blood-stained towel discovered by the K-9 unit, Malik had an irrefutable case. Imani Washington's wall of defense was about to come crashing down. He headed back to the police station, holding the evidence that would force her to face the horrific truth of what she had done in the darkness of the previous night. The final confrontation was about to begin. When Malik Brooks entered the interrogation room again, the air seemed to thicken. Imani looked up, her vacant eyes now holding a flicker of apprehension. Malik said nothing. He silently placed the clear plastic evidence bag containing the blood-stained towel on the metal table between them. The exhibit lay there, a silent but damning accusation. "We found this in the rose bed in your backyard, Mrs. Washington," Malik said, his voice calm but devoid of sympathy. "It has your husband's blood on it. Your fingerprints and only yours were on the murder weapon. Your sister Zora has told us everything about the affair, about the argument, about your husband coming back to the house to get his things. It's time for you to do the same. It's time to tell the truth." At the sight of the towel, the physical proof of her desperate cover-up, something inside Imani finally snapped. The defensive wall she had tried to build, the cold composure, the denial, it all crumbled. She lowered her head to the table, and her shoulders began to shake. At first it was just quiet sobs, but then it erupted into violent, agonizing wails. These were not the tears of remorse, but the cries of a soul that had been suppressed, betrayed, and shattered for 20 years. Her sobs echoed in the small room, a sound of raw, primal pain. After a long while, when the storm of tears had subsided, she began to speak. Her voice was broken, fragmented, interspersed with sobs. She recounted everything, not the fabricated story from before, but the raw, painful truth. She spoke of her cold marriage, of the loneliness in her own home, of her silent sacrifices to maintain a perfect image. She spoke of Zora's arrival, of the growing jealousy and suspicion. She spoke of the scene in the park, of her justice and the human heart being torn apart by the treacherous kiss. She spoke of the confrontation in the kitchen, of Leroy's cruel words, and finally of his confession about the other women. "He said I was just an obligation," she whispered, staring into space. "He said there had been others, many others. Everything I believed in was a lie." "I don't remember picking up the knife," she continued, her voice barely audible. "I just remember the coldness of it in my hand. I don't remember stabbing him. I just remember his surprised face. And then the silence. For the first time in years, I felt peace, a terrifying peace." Malik listened in silence, without interrupting. He had the confession he needed. He stood up and signaled to the female officer waiting outside the door. "Mrs. Imani Washington," he said formally, "you are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Leroy Washington." He began to read her Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer gently handcuffed her, Imani offered no resistance. She seemed to have accepted her fate. As they led her away, she didn't look like a cold-blooded killer. She looked like a broken woman, someone who had been pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance and had stepped over the line. A few days later, when the media frenzy had temporarily died down, Detective Malik Brooks returned to the Holy Atonement Church alone. The vast building was now empty and silent. Bouquets of flowers and candles had been placed outside in memory of the fallen pastor. He went inside and sat down in one of the wooden pews, looking up at the empty pulpit where Reverend Leroy Washington had once stood and preached about faithfulness and forgiveness. The case was legally closed. Amani Washington would face the justice system and would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. But Malik couldn't help but ponder the deeper questions that had no easy answers in police reports. The lesson here was not simply about a murder born of jealousy. The story of Amani and Leroy was a tragic reminder that the masks we wear in society, whether they are masks of piety, success, or happiness, can hide violent internal storms. The pressure to be perfect, especially for those in minority communities who always have to work twice as hard to be recognized, can create a prison of its own, a place where resentment and pain silently fester from within. It showed that faith and piety are not shields immune to the temptations and weaknesses inherent in human nature. Crime does not always stem from pure hatred or innate evil. Sometimes it is born from unbearable pain, from the desperation of a soul pushed to the brink. And perhaps the greatest lesson Malik learned as he sat in the silent church was that even in the most supposedly righteous souls, there is always a razor-thin line between sin and salvation, between endurance and eruption, a line that, when crossed, can leave behind an unsalvageable devastation, turning prayers into cries of mourning and a house of God into a crime scene.